I'm straight up just saying we should not have women in combat roles. It hasn't made us more effective, hasn't made us more lethal, has made fighting more complicated. We've all served with women, and they're great. It just, our institutions don't have to incentivize that in places where not traditionally, over human history, men in those positions are more capable.
That was Trump's defense secretary pick, Pete Hegseth, and I have to say, as a feminist, I have zero issue with what he just said. Let's talk about it. First, I'm Hannah Cox with Base Politics. Welcome to my channel where I bring you my politically homeless takes on politics and culture. Before we dive in today, make sure you like this video, subscribe to my channel if you have not already, and of course, ring that notification bell so you never miss one of my episodes. Now that the election is over and the dust is settling, the political news cycle is moving into the lame duck season, which is typically a time when absolutely no one but people like me pays attention to the political process. Selecting cabinet members, making political appointments, passing the budget. These are usually boring events that fly under the radar, but it seems since Trump has come along, all of you normies are paying attention to these things, which I love. It gives me a chance to actually cover some of this stuff for once, so we're gonna dig in today. My other dog, Lily, is biting at my ankle, so I guess she wants to be on camera today. Anyways, this clip of Pete resurfaced for one reason and one reason only. It's important to know that, and that's that people are pissed Trump has picked him for this position. And do not be fooled, because you're going to hear all kinds of reasons for why they don't like this pick, but there is actually one root cause and one root cause only, and that is that this guy is actually an anti-war selection. The military-industrial complex and all of the DC leeches who drink its blood are pressed about this nomination, and the mainstream media that does their bidding and basically just repeats whatever they're told by these people is following their lead. And then you have rank and file Democrats who just listen to absolutely anything the establishment tells them, so they're getting stirred up pretty easily over anything Trump does, no matter what. I see some of these people trying to say that Pete is unqualified, that he's just a Fox News host, and now they've resurfaced this clip to try to paint him as a sexist. I admittedly do not know a ton about Pete while I am on Fox News. I don't watch it that often, admittedly, so I'm largely unfamiliar with him. But what I do know is that a lot of principled anti-war people that I trust are really excited about this pick, namely among them Rand Paul and some of his staff members. And I explicitly trust that team. They're one of the only political factions I actually trust and I'm pretty aligned with. So when I see them pushing back on some of these narratives and championing Pete, that's a good indication to me. There was this news article that went around a couple days ago. Initially was circulated by Politico with a caption on Twitter that says, "Who the F is this guy? Defense World reacts to Trump's surprise Pentagon pick." And one of the quotes within the article was meant to smear Pete, but it actually was such a raging endorsement for him for anybody who's not within the neocon establishment agenda when it comes to foreign policy. The quote said, "One assessment of Pete was more blunt. Who the F is this guy?" said a defense industry lobbyist who was granted anonymity to offer candid views. The lobbyist said they had hoped for, quote, "someone who actually has an extensive background in defense. That would be a good start." And my friend Dan Caldwell, who is an excellent foreign policy wonk, if you want to follow somebody who has a lot of expertise on this subject matter. He's worked for years and years and years around the nonprofit world, actually working to end wars and stand up for veterans. He quote tweeted it and said, "I don't know, ma'am, but it might be a good thing that defense lobbyists representing companies that fleece the taxpayers of billions of dollars don't know who the F Pete is." If anything, this is his greatest endorsement so far. There were also apparently some people on the other side of the spectrum that were trying to argue that Pete himself is like a neocon warmonger, I guess because he's a veteran. But Dan also went to bat on that and said, "I've known Pete for over a decade. Like a lot of vets, his foreign policy views evolved as the forever wars dragged on and their costs soared. If you're calling him a neocon, you have no clue what you were talking about." My friend Zamina, who works for Rand Paul in his Senate office, said that Pete has dedicated many years as CEO of Concerned Vets, which is an excellent anti-war organization in DC. She said he's championed policies that protect freedom and standing strong for our vets. His advocacy has made a lasting impact on the lives of those he served. Now he gets to do it at a larger scale as the defense secretary. So I feel really excited about this pick personally. I have not been excited about some of the others. Like, I hate that Marco Rubio's name is getting circulated for Secretary of State. He is a warmongering neocon. And I am, I've never been like super bullish on Trump to begin with. Obviously, like I've said, we're going to get a lot of stuff I don't like. So him being elected and then immediately putting in neocons, that's what he did the first term. Even though he ran as being anti-war, he put people like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo in his administration, which were disgusting, abhorrent picks. And every libertarian that was paying attention said so at that time. And now he hates those guys because they turned on him. But unfortunately, it seems like his impulses to like cozy up to neocons has not totally been eliminated. So I'm happy to see this pick. I'm going to remain critical of some of the others. This graphic made me laugh. I saw Dave Smith on Twitter calling out some of this like cozying up to neocons that we're already seeing with Trump, with different names being tossed around. And Donald Trump Jr. quote tweeted him and said, agreed, 100, 100, 100, I'm on it. And then somebody quote tweeted Don Jr. that says, Don Jr. keeping neocons out of his father's administration. And it's just like the security guard barely patting people down and then letting them go into a venue. And that really is mostly what it's looked like. But again, Pete is a breath of fresh air. I think that it's important that Trump not cozy up to neocons again, not only because I think it was detrimental for him the first time around, but also because while it was a secondary issue, I think it came after the economy and after immigration. Trump being more anti-war than the Democrats are right now, at least, was a major other reason that caused many people to vote for him. A lot of people are concerned with the growing global tensions that America is continuing to not only involve itself in, but to escalate. And so most people are really hoping that Trump will be will turn the page on some of that, particularly as it pertains to some of the Russia and Ukraine stuff. I would say also as it pertains to some of the Israel and Palestine stuff, although I think there's less potential for him to get us out of that. But all that being said, it would be a slap in the face to voters who were voting for him because of his anti-war stances to then surround himself with warmongers. So anyways, all that to say, that's why you now have these clips resurfacing trying to paint Pete as a bad guy, as a sexist. And of course, it is working to some extent in response to this clip circulating on Twitter. I saw a number of people weighing in who were infuriated by it. This girl said, when we said they were going to take away our rights, this is what we meant. You meant they were going to take away your right to go kill innocent people overseas and potentially get killed yourself in an unjust, unconstitutional war? Okay. This guy said, Trump seems to be picking people who have zero qualifications, so maybe it's window dressing. And like, this is just so stupid to me. Like, yes, this guy is a Fox News host right now, but newsflash, you don't typically just walk into that kind of role. It's a pretty lucrative and prestigious role, no matter how you feel about Fox News or any other cable news network. Like, most of these people have pretty extensive backgrounds to have gotten to that place in their career, and Pete is no different. So it's funny to me that the mainstream media is running with this whole thing of like, he's just a Fox News commentator. And everyone's like, yeah, that's all he's ever done in his life. Another person said, just call Pete Hegseth General Bro. Donald Trump doesn't want experts. He just wants sycophantic hacks who play them on TV. Like, this guy's been in war. He is a veteran. And not only that, but he's then been an advocate working around actual institutions that are singularly focused on this issue. I'm positive he is much more of an expert on this than any of his detractors. And lastly, this guy said, I don't get why anyone is surprised by Trump's picks. Outraged, absolutely, but nobody should be surprised. Like, what are you outraged about? Do you even actually know? Do you have like an articulable debate against this pick? I mean, do you know anything about him? No, I know you don't. I know you've done zero research. You saw this 20-second clip and made up your mind, which is just ridiculous. And like I said at the top of the episode, I am a feminist, but like, is this seriously what feminism is fighting for? The right for women to go get maimed and killed, or at the very least be mentally harmed by the horrors of war? Like, you must be joking, right? Because I've been talking about this on other social media platforms today, I've already seen some of the pushback I'm going to get in filming this episode that I'm going to get ahead of. But number one, I've had so many people telling me that women have been in combat for decades and decades in this country and that nothing's ever bad has ever happened, nothing's gone wrong. No, sweeties, women were not allowed in combat in the US until 2016. Yes, women have been allowed to serve in the military long before that, but they've not been allowed in combat roles. You understand there's a difference. And that is what we're actually discussing here. I don't think anybody is arguing that women should not be allowed in the military. No, I think most people, me included, are saying women should absolutely be in the military. Women should be able to access the vast majority of roles in the military. Women should be paid equally for those roles in the military. The one exception is that women should not be in combat roles in the military. And there are very solid reasons for that, reasons that I would argue are actually pretty feminist in and of themselves. Feminism, the true form of feminism, obviously there are many factions underneath that term, some of which I would argue are anti-woman at base, but true feminism is fighting for equality between the sexes, equality under the law specifically, which we have. But having equal rights does not mean that people have equal physical abilities. And it is okay to acknowledge that men and women have different strengths and weaknesses. I think this plays specifically into the very, very fringe segment of the population on the far left that refuses to acknowledge there are biological differences between men and women, which I just think is stupid. It is so stupid. You can be pro-trans people. You can love trans people. You can support trans people without buying into that BS that is fundamentally false. You do not get to claim to be the party of science, the party of experts, the party of truth, if you cannot acknowledge that reality. It is so absurd to watch you guys do this. Women are simply built different than men. They have different physical capabilities. There is no argument against that. I've heard people saying well, the military is not hand-to-hand combat anymore. They're not carrying around bayonets. I know, Sherlock, I know what war looks like these days. You apparently don't though, because you seem to not be aware that there are still very serious physical restraints and limitations that women face in these roles. They are already far more prone to injury in these roles, actually, because they are still having to walk long distances and carry very heavy equipment and loads. And that is something that has already taken a toll on many of the women in these roles. They have seen an increase in the number of injuries that they have. They do not have the same endurance or speed that men have working within these restraints. You are so ignorant. There are significant physiological differences, including things like muscle mass, upper body strength, endurance, and all of those things can impact physical performance, especially in demanding roles like combat roles. And on top of that, many female veterans have pointed to increased health risks that they face in these roles, including musculoskeletal injuries from carrying heavy gear over long distances. And there also are concerns that women may be more vulnerable to specific injuries like facial injuries and have unique health challenges in these environments. I like how this person pointed out if women aren't playing on the same team as men in sports, then it's insane to think when life and death is on the line that you would have women on the front lines. And I've seen a lot of people saying, the standard should be if women can meet the same requirements as men, then they should be allowed in these roles. Here's one example. This person, if they pass the male fitness standards for strength and endurance, they should be able to be in combat. If they cannot, they should not. But the thing is, they can't and they aren't. And because they can't and they aren't, the military has reduced physical fitness standards for women. So you're not dealing in reality when you say that, because it's simply not happening. Furthermore, let's say that there is some tiny percentage of she-women out there that are capable of meeting every single standard that male soldiers must meet. I would still argue that making arrangements for that tiny percentage of people would still be inefficient and costly and not something the military should be wasting its time doing. Think about it. If you add women into these units, you have to have separate living quarters, sanitation facilities. You're going to need specific medical care access that meets their unique needs. You're going to have to enforce policies and develop it's the military. So like probably whole divisions for developing policies and enforcement around things like sexual harassment and trainings and prevention. Not that those things work now, by the way, they don't, which I'll get to in a minute. Like, tell me you have never been in management or run a budget before without telling me. This doesn't make any sense to pursue. And when it comes to government, I will argue across the board that the government should always be doing the least amount possible, and it should always be making the most efficient use of the resources that it is given. I cannot understand why anybody would argue that we need to devote our resources to maybe, which I don't even think is that many, but a tiny, tiny percentage of women who would want to be in these roles and who could meet those requirements. Like, why? To virtue signal, to placate the 10% of people who are too delusional to accept that men and women have different biological standards and abilities. This is not the place. This is not the place for that. The military is not a social justice program. It is life and death. And it's life and death, by the way, not just for individuals, but for their whole units. This person on Twitter said half the species evolved to confront enemies with physicality. The other half had to confront the enormous physical burden of childbirth. The left evolved to imagine 150 million years of evolution can be ignored and inverted to make sure no one gets their feelings hurt. And that's really what this is. It's not about anything other than placating people and worrying about their feelings. And that's just simply not what we need to be doing when it comes to the military. Like, hang it up. This isn't an Ironman competition. If you need to go out and be as strong as every other man and prove that that's like within your realm of possibility, and somehow that's what makes you feel equal or feel like you've achieved, true feminism goals, like go do some weightlifting competitions. Who cares? I think that's ridiculous, but it's not a time and place to prove that on the front lines when other people's lives are impacted. This guy on Twitter said, apparently modern feminism is when the government sends women to die in another pointless war. Like, yeah, seriously, I don't understand how this is in any way, shape, or form what feminism has been focusing on. Like, it's the exact opposite of a human rights issue. The human rights issue is ending the wars. Secondarily, even if a percentage of women could meet the standards and requirements for combat in order to offset the costs and the inefficiency of adding them into these units, there are still many other arguments against them being in these roles. Chiefly among them is the epidemic of sexual assault that is already so prevalent within our military. As my handy dandy little ChatGPT notepad says, sexual assault, including rape, has been a serious and persistent issue within the U.S. military. Despite efforts to address it, reports of sexual assault remain high, and many cases go unreported due to fears of retaliation, stigma, or lack of faith in the reporting process. In recent years, the Department of Defense has conducted surveys to estimate the prevalence of sexual assault, and while exact numbers vary, these surveys consistently suggest that thousands of service members experience sexual assault each year. And by the way, women do not just face a unique threat in the form of sexual assault from their fellow servicemen, which is awful enough. They also face a significant threat if they are captured. As Kyle on Twitter said, everyone else I've talked to in the military agrees. They've also told me it's because they don't want them to get captured. If they were to get captured somewhere in the Middle East, well, I think we know. And it's not just the Middle East. It's literally everywhere. This has been one of the top war crimes that has been perpetrated against women throughout time. They are already at threat of that when they are civilians. I mean, the putting them in the position of actually being on the front lines where they can be captured, like, it's actually terrifying to think about. And I think when women are taken prisoner of war, there is an escalated concern for getting them out due to this additional threat that can really weaken our side when we're having to come to the table in those kinds of matters. And this is why I have seen so many female veterans actually coming out and agreeing with Pete. This girl, Sarah, said, right, as a veteran, I 1000% agree. Another woman said, as a young woman in the Army, I disagreed with the no combat restrictions, but I saw firsthand, even in training, where men would fall all over themselves to help a girl in distress, whereas if it were another guy, they'd just say, suck it up, buttercup, and move on. It's not just the physical standards that were lowered, it's the whole mentality that we can do everything a man can do, and it eventually breaks down the whole. And lastly, this woman said, I was in the Army. I feel like I could do a lot of stuff. I was a tomboy growing up, but combat for women, no thank you. I don't care how badass of a woman you are or how manly you are when it comes to combat. I'm sorry, it takes a man to do that job. Like, I cannot stand sexism. I call it out all the time on this platform, but I really see very little evidence that people are coming from a sexist place here. Well, I mean, there are a few jackasses like this guy I've seen in the comments, Adam Krigler. putting his whole name out there in case you want to go leave him a note, says women belong in the kitchen. I think Adam belongs in the yard, but anyways. But again, like the vast majority of men that I've seen responding to this were more like this guy. This guy says every woman has a father or a brother or a husband that is sickened at the thought of her going into combat. The entire motivation for men going into combat is to protect their women. It's not glory. It's just that men would rather die than see harm come to their women. Like, war is heinous and awful and grotesque. And again, I really think the human rights issue should be that we are working to ensure fewer and fewer and fewer people ever see it, men and women. But like the urge that men have to protect women, to protect their homeland, that's a good thing. I think we should encourage that. I made a whole episode a few weeks ago talking about how I don't see men as largely being the protectors in society these days, and how that's a real deficiency in our culture. There's a real void there. I think part of that is that when those instincts do come up in situations like this, they are shouted down, they are maligned, they are attributed to sexism, and that's simply not true. On top of all of these factors for why I am perfectly fine with the argument that women should not be in combat, there is a pretty hefty study backing up the numbers here. This is a headline that was published by NPR in 2015 that says Marine Corps studies all male combat units perform better than mixed units. And in the article, they say a year-long Marine Corps study trying to understand how gender integration would affect combat readiness has found that all male units were faster, more lethal, and able to evacuate casualties in less time. Overall, according to a summary of the study, all male squads perform better than mixed groups in 69% of the tasks evaluated. NPR's Tom Bowman filed this report for our newscast unit. He wrote, the Marines created a battalion of 100 female and 300 male volunteers. During the past year, they trained in North Carolina and California, taking part in realistic combat exercises. All male squads, the study found, performed better than mixed gender units across the board. The males were more accurate at hitting targets, faster at climbing over obstacles, better at avoiding injuries. The Marine study says its main focus is maximum combat effectiveness because it means fewer casualties. The Marines have not said whether the study's results will lead them to ask for a waiver that bars women from ground combat jobs. And then the study goes on to list a number of metrics that they evaluated men and women for in the study. One of them is speed. They said all male squads, regardless of infantry, were faster than the gender integrated squads. They also looked at lethality. They looked at injuries. They looked at physiology differences between the men and women. So again, I have to press the question of why would we do this? There is really no good argument for doing it, except the fact that you want to placate a small number of people who refuse to live in reality. And that is simply nothing the government should be concerned with. Men can't make babies, okay? They can't find their protein mix if you hide it behind the peanut butter. And women shouldn't be in combat. We're different. It's okay. This is not a hill for the feminists to die on. What feminists and all human rights advocates should be focused on, first and foremost, is eliminating the draft. Because if we say that we are fighting for the equality of the sexes, the draft being on the table for men and not women is sexist and wrong. It's a disgusting thing on our books. It needs to be overturned immediately. And then they need to focus on ending our forever wars, which would ensure fewer men and women give their lives for other countries' wars, or for the corrupt concerns of the military-industrial complex, which sends us into wars that have nothing to do with our security or our constitution, but that do incur blowback, waste our resources overseas, destabilize entire regions, and weaken us in the long run. All right, guys, I hope you liked this episode. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to my channel if you have not already, and if you want even more content, you can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, or TikTok.